I'd like to hand it off now to the presenter of today's session, Paul Campbell.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining me for the next 30 minutes. There's a lot of material that we'll cover during the next 30 minutes, so I'd like to go ahead and begin and get started. For today's session, what we'll talk about is a couple of items and outcomes that I'd like you to capture. One is we'll talk about the current state of affairs in the industry and with businesses and how they're using scorecards. And then we'll transition into how we've seen effective use of scorecards in terms of integration into the overall process of an organization. Obviously, the goal is to not only capture data, but also engage the organization, and that's what we'll talk about today. The current state of affair, there's a lot of research that's been done in terms of use of scorecards and how people are deploying those. There was good research that happened a couple of years ago, and what it showed is about 50% of organizations around the world actually use some type of scorecard, whether it's Excel, it's manual, it's a system, et cetera. They use some type of scorecard solution. And those that use the solution are very satisfied with what they're doing. You can see from the second chart that's listed here is there's a lot of additional data that people capture in these research reports. But what's interesting is scorecards and their use of it continues to increase. It used to be ranking around the 20th item in terms of usage. Now it's around 13th overall usage within organizations. So it continues to become an important factor within organizations and their overall success. What's interesting, though, is while people use scorecards and competition continues to push you very hard and there's new entrants into the marketplace, what we see is there's not a connection between what's tracked, how businesses actually are doing, and how employees understand that business and their connection to the overall business. What this next slide shows you is actually a demonstration of that from another research report that's out there that very clearly says that people feel disconnected from the overall strategy of organizations. It's a very high percentage, and some may argue there's a lower percent. But typically what we find is when you ask employees, do they feel they understand the overall organization's goals and objectives and how they fit into that? And the answer typically is no, and I think this demonstrates that information. What this tells you, though, is in the consequences of not connecting the employees, the strategic goals, the tactical goals in there, not engaging that organization overall, is leaders typically take ownership and accountability for their performance of their teams. But what we find is they struggle significantly to drive that down to the employee level. You want to, again, engage everybody, and the previous slide kind of demonstrates that is 95% of the people feel disconnected or not familiar enough with the strategic goals of the organization. The second is, what we find is people use metrics for viewing as static data instead of using these as a pulse or a guide to affect change, which is really what data is. It's a tool to help affect change out there. And what we find is because of that, it creates a culture that has sporadic focus. So sporadic focus is you're not dedicated to looking at the data and use and change of data. Also the urgency. You don't have the dedication urgency of making changes, rapidly adjusting to what's happening within your own organization as well as the marketplace. And selective engagement. If people don't feel connected to what's happening within your business, they're not going to be engaged. And you'll find that there's selective engagement and you're driven by the crisis of the moment instead of a process. So Dave, let me stop here and let's ask the audience for poll number 1.
Great, I'll launch that right now. Give everyone about 15 more seconds. Okay, we got about 5 seconds left here. All right, I'll close that. There are the results, Paul.
Great, I appreciate it. So, if you look at the results here, again, what we're just talking about is, do people feel connected to the business? It's still a high percent of people don't feel connected to the business and understand how they're impacting the organization from their role. Thanks, Dave. So what does this mean?
I apologize. It looks like Paul might have been quickly disconnected. Give us a second. He's reconnecting onto the line.
Dave, I'm back.
Okay, great, Paul.
Okay, I apologize about that. My phone disconnected from the session, so I apologize. So what we were talking about is effective use of scorecards in the industry. We've seen a number of different things. One is, scorecards are used as a tool to track your business. They very quickly should tell you, are you winning or losing? That answer should be within the first 5 seconds. It really should tell you that answer. It should display the information in a way where you can visually see what's happening in your business and ask the right questions of what's going on. The second is a common language. We see all too often where metrics are being measured on scorecards across organizations, and it may be a common metric like accidents or another metric within your organization. But what we find is it's written differently, it's described differently, even though it really means the same thing. So how do you effectively track and manage and measure different organizations' plans, teams, sites, etc., if they're writing things and measuring things differently within the organization? So the common business language becomes critical to what you do. Accountability, we've also found that while scorecards can engage a team, if you don't have the team responsible for metrics on your scorecard and each employee responsible for something, they feel disengaged. We've seen time and time again where a leader takes ownership of every single metric on their team scorecard, but what happens is the employees feel disengaged because it's the leader's responsibility. While conversely, if you have each employee responsible for a metric, they become completely engaged and very engaged in the process of making sure the team is continuing to improve out there. Same thing for establishing the priorities that link to the corporate objectives. Again, back to the slide of 95% of the people don't feel connected to the strategic objectives of the organization. Make sure you have the link between the strategic versus tactical activities going on. And then the last is equipping the leaders within your organization with the tools to make those decisions. Again, scorecards are tools and they're input into making the decision process. They are not the end-all decision-making. They're just a tool. They're information. So what you need to consider is, while you have a scorecard, you need to have supporting processes in place to help you manage the scorecard, the data, the action, the communication. All those things need to be in place to be effective in terms of how you're using scorecards. So what we'll talk about is 3 aspects of using scorecards. First is connectivity, second is consistency, and third is clarity. We'll get into more detail in each one of these as we go through the session. So let me start with connectivity. What we encounter in a lot of organizations is they're very good at setting strategic goals, but they really struggle, as we mentioned before, in defining and managing the tactical level. How do you transition from knowing exactly what you want to do at your executive level down to your shift level, your plant level, etc.? So the end result by not doing that is you create a misalignment. Instead, what you need to consider is taking the information and deploying it down into the tactical level, so change from strategy to tactics, and we'll talk about that a lot throughout this presentation. So what does it really get to you in terms of how they connect every part of the organization to be effective in how you use scorecards? So there are a few things and key critical success factors that we found within organizations. First is common format. The leadership team or the executive team needs to create a template that contains that common language, that common format, what required metrics that they want to be managed and visible on each of the teams. That starts the basis that everyone can follow. As an example, a key focus area could be something like quality or cost or productivity. If the leadership team establishes those are the standards that need to be followed by every single scorecard below it. What happens then at the tactical level, which you need to encourage, is each team then needs to develop their own set of metrics that fall within each of those categories being measured, as well as the metrics that are to be measured by the executive team at each of these individual levels. And what that allows you to do is the tactical teams not only can look at how they are performing, but also how they're contributing to the overall success of the organization. Next is, as you think about scorecards, look at the ownership of the metrics. Now, these are people who can impact the metric. They can control the outcome of the metric. They can also adjust and control the performance of that metric. So if you don't have the answers to those questions, or you answer no to those questions, you need to seriously consider if you have the right owner identified for those metrics. I'll give you an example. Time to fill open vacancies. That's always an issue that we find on scorecards of where it belongs. Is it a human resources metric? Is it a business unit metric? Where does it belong? Ultimately, what we find is business units are the ones responsible because the employees are being hired by those teams. They have supporting groups that are responsible for helping them achieve that, but ultimately the business unit has responsibility. So make sure you find the right owner of those metrics that you define. Smart metrics and defining smart metrics, these are information that helps the team understand and employees understand how the metrics are being measured and what they mean. It's always good to have a good definition of the metric and what you're trying to achieve as an outcome. As an example here would be if you have overtime on your scorecard, maybe you want to think about changing that to read reduce overtime by 2% within first 3 months and 5% within the first 6 months. That tells people exactly what they're doing and how they're doing so they can quickly identify the changes that are going on. Next is realistic targets. One of the things that we find continually within companies is they set targets at world-class levels, but they're nowhere near their opportunity of achieving those goals. What happens is you now have a disconnection between how the employees feel they can perform and achieve versus what you're trying to achieve as an overall organization. So instead of when you set these targets, set realistic targets. Set targets where people can feel successful in their business, but ultimately leads to where you want to go. One of the ways you can do that is set these glide paths. Establish targets that are short-term. They could be 3 months or 6 months. I want to change and I want to reduce my number of accidents within 30% by the first 3 months and 60% versus the next 6 months. Give those glide paths where people feel like they're engaged and can be successful in the goals you establish for them. Also, make sure that when you're reviewing the scorecards, they're not static. The static data will kill you. It is data that should be relevant to what you're doing, but also needs to adjust to your business and to the market changes that are influencing what you're doing in your business. We encourage you, and we'll talk a little more about this, of the frequency of doing this. What we will also find is we typically experience organizations will have 4 to 6 iterations of scorecards before they actually land on a final result of what their scorecard is. So it's something that's evolving, something that's dynamic out there. The other thing on building your scorecard is making sure that you have leading versus lagging indicators on your scorecard. Many scorecards that we take a look at today are great at measuring past performance, and it's good for historical trending, but what it doesn't necessarily tell you is what the future holds. So what we encourage you to look at is have a combination or a balance between lagging and leading indicators on your scorecards. So Dave, let me stop here and let's ask for poll number 2.
Okay, great. I'm launching that now, Paul. All right, give everyone another 15 seconds here to answer poll number 2. Five seconds. All right, here we go. There are the results, Paul.
Great, I appreciate it. So you can see from the results here, and it was actually very consistent with some of the results we had earlier today in a similar webinar, is either there's no scorecard that's developed, or there's no standards that are developed and pushed down from strategic or your executive levels. So again, it makes it difficult to help you manage what's going on in your business. Thanks, Dave. So as you think about scorecards and what's happening with scorecards, a couple of things I want you to think about. You have strategies to help succeed in all areas, so why not scorecards? First step is creating this scorecard. You want to have the ability to have something that's color-coded, it's quick at a glance view, and allows you to narrow down your focus on what you're looking at. What this allows you to do is Within those 5 seconds, I can take a look at what areas need improvement, how I'm doing overall, and I don't have to spend a lot of time trying to analyze this. I can quickly identify and focus on those areas. Again, a sense of urgency of where you want to spend your time. In addition, what we find within this is it creates consistency. So if these scorecards are developed at the executive level and the format is the same at each team level, you now have a consistent rhythm you can establish when anyone's taking a look at their scorecards of how they're viewing the information, and they know if they're going to look at cost and productivity and customer service, those 3 categories will be measured on every single scorecard that exists. What this helps you do, once you have consistency and you're driven, it creates these comparatives that you can build. This allows you to then begin to look at and ask the questions during meetings is best practices. As an example, if you look at reduced defects here, why is the Dallas team performing well? What are they doing differently that helps them perform well? What are the best practices that are in place here? This, by creating that consistency in what you're doing, it helps you measure and manage that information. So here what you can look at is best practices. You can look at global issues or local issues that may be happening. You can share corrective actions that are going on. It opens that dialogue between the people as, okay, I see you're not performing, so let me tell you what I'm doing in my team that may help you perform better on your team. Get that dialogue going within the organization. Another way to take a look at this is looking at each of the areas of the organization and those key focus areas, and again, looking at each team and seeing how well they're doing. Within each team, you may have different metrics that make up these categories, but again, at a holistic view, you have the opportunity to look at the information and look at how they're performing in quality or cost or safety. Again, they should be consistent across the team. So it leverages the scorecard to create that. It generates that best practices, conversations, and the comparatives, what's happening. But think of the business as a ball game. You know, a good comparison there is if you want to know who won a game, you look at a scoreboard. If you're losing team and want to win, you don't look at the scoreboard by watching that. You actually take action. You take a look at every aspect of your team to figure out where you're not performing well and make adjustments. Similar to this on business. Take a look at each area of your opportunity and look at this. And this doesn't apply necessarily just to your part of your organization. It can apply to suppliers, it can apply to third parties. You can create these comparatives to really manage every part and every aspect of your business. So as you get into the consistency of looking at your business, okay, now you've built your scorecards and you develop those, what we find in a lot of cases is people spend a tremendous amount of energy and time implementing scorecards, getting data into the system, but they neglect to plan on how they're going to leverage that information within the scorecard. So if you're not careful, you create an expensive picture that has stale data. So think about, as you go through it, implementing and integrating into communication. How are people talking about it? Your accountability, your action register, and your performance, and your best practices. So Dave, let me stop here and let's do poll number 3.
All right, I'm launching that now. Give everyone about 15 seconds to answer poll 3. All right, 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm closing that. Here are the results, Paul.
Great, thank you. So this is actually, again, very consistent to what we saw earlier today. Is it's an inconsistent measure. Are you tying them directly to actions and metrics or not? And you can see here more than half the people say sometimes, and even some are not tying it. So it's a good indication that you need to think about connecting the dots in here. So what do you have? You have built a scorecard, you have these metrics that you're measuring, you have this data that's relevant out there. So what do you do around that? Building an action register, an action plan, or decision log, whatever you're going to call it, and relating those 2 components together is an important part of overall success of your business. There was a study I recently read that talked about how people use scorecards, and what they said is 83% of the respondents said they use it for business action. However, what it didn't tell you is, do they have these 2 things related? And as we saw from the results of the poll, It's not necessarily the case. They're not relating to together. So think about, as you build things, relating the actions and the metrics together. So I can clearly understand my metrics underperforming, and here are the things that I'm doing to be successful. Here are the things that I'm changing to be successful. And anyone then can take a look at it. Employees become engaged in what's happening. Also on the action register, I want you to consider here making sure you have descriptions of what you're doing as an action, and it's clear. You have a responsible party, and you have a target date. So people not only can look at the performance of the metric and how they're doing, but also people can understand clearly and visually how they're doing against the actions that are assigned to them. Again, set that goals for them. So once you have the actions, once you have the scorecards developed, there's processes that need to be in place. There's repetitive nature. You need to look at all this information. What this I'm showing on the screen is, it's an example of an agenda that we talk to companies about using to be successful. It's that rhythm they establish on their meetings. So when you look at meetings here, really what the objective should be for any type of meeting when you look at scorecards is keep the team focused, keep those meetings, it would be ideal to keep within 30 minutes, maintain a high level of urgency and focus on what you're doing, whether it's the actions or it's the scorecard and measuring those, and create a high degree of transparency. Employees always complain, you can see it on employee surveys consistently, is they don't know, they don't have the information, people aren't sharing data with them. Make it readily available. Why are we hiding things from people? We hire them for a reason. They should be engaged in helping our business become successful. So as you think about going through your meetings, look at your actions. What are the past due actions? What are the present actions? Look at your scorecard. Review your scorecard. Give people that opportunity to take a look at and ask questions or go around the table. Again, this is a focused conversation, and we'll talk more about this in future webinars, but this is a 30, 60-second conversation. This is not something where they can espouse for 30 minutes. Keep it focused. Keep it on task at what you're doing. Same thing for recognition. What we find is people tend to focus on negatives. They focus on the fire drill. They don't focus on the positives of the organization. They don't focus on the contributions of organization. Take an initiative of recognizing people. It changes culture. It changes behavior, which is part of this overall process that's happening. Pass-up, pass-down term that we've coined, but this is communication, making sure people are aligned properly. Action register review, why people ask us why we have a second review. This is really to make sure that when people walk out of the room of the meeting, they clearly understand any action captured during that meeting. I know who's responsible.
Fortunately, we're having a couple technical difficulties with power outages here. I think we lost Paul again. If you can give us 1 minute, he'll be right back on the line.
Group, I apologize. I don't know why my phone is dropping, but so I really apologize. It's even a landline. So the last thing we're talking about is the action register, so people understand clearly what's happening in there. And meeting audit, the last thing I'll say about this is, as you go through your meetings, make sure that there's a conversation at the end of it. Are we moving the business forward? Are we being successful in our conversations? Are we keeping on task? Are we staying focused in our conversations? It helps people from a clarity standpoint understand when they come into a meeting, it's a focused agenda, it's a focused conversation, it's not going to go around the table and spend an hour in the conversation. It really stays on task. People then become more engaged, employees become more engaged in the process of what's happening. So let me recap what we talked about, and again, I apologize for the dropping a couple of times. The effective scorecards that we've seen, we talked about tracking results. Well, people have thermometers. They're managing their business based upon static data. Well, think about changing that approach where you have a thermostat. It measures the temperature, but also adjusts based upon your goals. So always continually adjust based upon where you want to go as a business. That common language we saw from the polls and from some of the research studies out there, develop the consistency in how you measure, eliminate confusion, set the standards out there. Let your executive team set those standards that people can follow, that common business language. Accountability, again, not having the leaders or executives ultimately responsible for each of the metrics out there. Make other people responsible for the metrics. Engage the people in the success of your business. It really changes behavior and culture, which is, again, which we're trying to achieve. And again, equip your leaders with tools. Have solutions, whatever solution you're going to implement. Let them have a tool in space that helps them understand what their business is doing, how their business is doing, and ties in the actions so that not only they can understand it, but also the entire organization can understand how they're performing, and it gives the visibility into looking at things like best practices that you can share. Dave, I know I'm kind of gone quickly and apologize about the couple of drops, but I'm sure there's some great questions that were asked.
Absolutely, Paul. We had some really good questions submitted throughout the session. We have a couple minutes to address a few of those. The first one, how many metrics do you suggest having on a scorecard?
Great question. What we see is really scorecards, 5 to 7 key business focus areas like cost, quality, productivity, and no more than 10 to 15 metrics. When you get a lot of metrics on a scorecard, you lose that sense of focus and urgency on the scorecard. And again, back to the goal. The goal is, are you winning or are you losing within the 5 seconds? If you've got 30, 40, 50 metrics on the scorecard, you can't tell that. Make it simple, make it succinct, make it direct. It also allows you to look at, okay, how are we doing those metrics and have that dialogue in the conversation. And again, remember, red metrics on scorecards, they're not punitive. They're just ways of how you recognize and where the areas of improvement are needed.
Great, Paul. I have one other question. How often should I review my team's scorecard?
Good, great question. I recommend that you review your scorecards at least once a week. Your executives maybe once a month, but again, you should be no more than once a month. What that allows you to do is allows you to adjust your business based upon what's happening. Don't wait 3 months. Don't wait each quarter or semi-annual or annual. Make it a frequent process that you're looking at your business continually and making adjustments. Whether the leader is part of a meeting or not, those meetings should happen. There are also great ways to educate, recognize success, take actions, motivate continuous improvement by having those continual repetitive meetings out there. I also recommend as part of this, not only should you be reviewing the information and data presented, you should be reviewing the metrics themselves on at least a quarterly basis to take a look at, are they still relevant? Are the goals still relevant? And adjust. Don't feel like they have to stay out there for an entire year. Make adjustments as your business changes. The biggest mistake people find is it's an annual goal and I can't change it. That's a big mistake. If you find your business is changing, adapt. That's all the industry is about, adaptation. So make sure you're adapting your scorecards accordingly. Okay, so what I encourage you to do is there's an exit survey. I'd encourage you to take a look at. You can ask for examples of metrics and action register template you'll receive from this point forward. I'm not on. You're not on either. You can look at Tuesday tips. I'm sorry. You can look at Tuesday tips. Monthly webinar for next month is Leadership Fundamentals for First-Timers and Frontliners. Seth Davies will be doing that. You can contact us at webinars@competitivesolutions.net or visit either of our websites out there. Again, I appreciate and apologize for the technical problems we had today. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that you found and walk away with some valuable tips on how to use scorecards for business success in all areas of your organization. Thank you again.